This is the Human Crap Podcast, and I'm your host, Beth Huddleston. My guest today is Nicca Ray. Nicca is the author of Ray by Ray, a daughter's take on the legend of Nicca Ray, which is a blend of memoir and biography about her famous father and the impact of his absence in her life. She is also the author of poetry collections titled Backseat Baby, Curve, and Go, 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 Girl. Her second memoir, Love and Cigarettes, is coming soon, and her play Cry of the Butterfly will be performed in New York City in the fall of 2025. In our interview, Nicca and I discussed the impact of addiction and sexual abuse in her life and family, the ways in which her legendary filmmaker father's absence affected her life, and how she ultimately found healing, peace, and connection. Nicca, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited.
Yeah, it's really good to have you here. I read your memoir. It's called Ray on Ray. And this is a memoir about your life, but really also about your parents. And both of your parents, from reading your book, were kind of larger than life characters in Hollywood. And so that's just kind of a whole different vantage point that you have. Your father, Nicca Ray, was a director. You know, he directed Rebel Without a Cause with James Dean and all these other Humphrey Bogart movies and all these things. And so he's got this like big, personhood in Hollywood. And your mom, she was always working in Hollywood, dancer and actress and all this. So that's the background of it. But then in the midst of that, you're navigating your own life as a child and really with an absent father who's a larger than life character. So that's where I want to dive in first with your father and his absence in your life, because I think that having an absent father would be really a big presence in its own way, because you're always thinking, oh, maybe he'd understand me better if he were here, or my mom doesn't, if it's a father, my mom doesn't understand me, and that kind of thing, or imagining what life would be like with them. And so it's, even though they're not there, there's a whole thing that's created. In your case, you also had a father who you would hear about his movies, you would hear about what he was up to and hear people talking about him, but you didn't get to see him very often. So tell me about that. Tell me about, any part of that, having an absent father, and then also having your dad be this big personality in Hollywood and having him be absent.
Well, I always felt that I should be with my father from a very young age. My parents separated when I was 2.5, and I didn't see him again until I was 12. And my mom and I had a really hard time in our relationship. Like when I was a baby, I had nannies that took care of me. And my mom was, she had her issues and she wasn't present. So when my mom left Spain and went to Los Angeles, and when my sister and I joined my mom in Los Angeles and she picked us up at the airport, I didn't know who she was. So I was 2.5 years old and I didn't know who my mother was. And that sort of set the tone for our relationship, and I believe set me up to idolize my father, because of course I'm his namesake. So I always dreamed that I belonged with him, and his absence was a big part of my growing up. And because I knew he was in Europe, I didn't know anything about his career. I didn't know that his career had taken a dive. But I knew he was in Europe, so I told myself he was in Europe making movies. And I built this glamorous life for him while I watched my mom struggle. And I saw her frustrations and felt her frustrations of being a single mom who wasn't getting child support, and the pressures that she had. She left Hollywood and got a job in an office so that she would be able to support my sister and I and provide a home for us. And she should have never left dance. So her frustrations made me really uncomfortable. And I just envisioned my father as being this God. He wouldn't get frustrated. He would give me what I wanted. He would have time to listen to me read my stories. He would be everything that my mother was not. Another thing about having an absentee father is you can look at your mother. Like I could look at my mother and go, oh, I don't look like my mother. But my mom didn't even keep pictures of my father around the house. So like I could go to a bookstore and find a picture of my father, but like what did I look like? Who did I look like? I didn't look like my mother or my sister. At least I didn't think I did, when I was a kid. So it was always like looking in the mirror and wondering who I am. And of course I must look like my father. Everything about me must be my father. That's how I grew up. That's how I dealt with his absence, you know.
Do you remember as a child, I totally understand what you're saying, and I can imagine a lot of people probably can share that experience when they have an absentee parent. But do you remember, was there ever any like blame that you put on him for not being there when you were growing up? Or did you?
Oh no, I didn't. Everything was my mother's fault. My poor mother. She would, she would get so mad at me. She was so mad at him. She used to always say, "There he goes. He's going around scallivanting in his silk shirts while I'm slaving away. You should think about that for a minute." It's like, no,
Mhm.
I really did not come to terms with the negative side, the real negative side of how I felt about his absence until I was writing Ray by Ray,
Wow.
until I gathered all the information and could not deny things anymore because everything was right out in front of me. Like he was not there, he was purposefully not there.
Yeah, and that's the thing. There's so much in your book, and you actually did really research it and go in and interview people and learned about both of your parents' lives and learned about the whole story behind your father and his absence and what he was up to. And reading your book, there was such a feeling of chaos. I had a feeling of chaos. I mean, not when your mother tried to settle down and, before she married your stepfather, and she was just wow, I mean, good for her. Like when she didn't have money anymore and she was trying to survive with you and your sister. But then with your stepfather and with your dad's life, there was a lot of chaos. There was a lot going on there, and so that there's that feeling throughout your book of a chaotic environment. I mean, your father was really, really an addict. I mean, he was really deep into addiction. It sounds like for most of or all of his adult life until the very
Right.
end. So that was a key piece to his behavior and his absence and all of that. So when you took a look at that, what did you see about that, about the chaos with his life, about his addiction? In looking back at that when you wrote the book, how did you see all of that in terms of him and his absence and how he behaved?
It was easier to look at his addiction before I was born, in the years before I was born. And, he was doing cocaine in the 1930s when he was involved in the theater in the Lower East Side. And he was notorious for carrying out around a briefcase of pharmaceuticals. He had mental illness and it wasn't being treated, and they were just giving him all kinds of, they didn't know what they were doing, and they were giving him all kinds of drugs. And he was always drinking. It's like my mom said, when she married my dad, she didn't know what vodka smelled like. She thought that his odor was a perfume, not the vodka, coming out of his pores. So he was a bad alcoholic like his father had been, and he suffered. His niece, who became a clinical psychiatrist, believed that both my father's father and my father suffered from bipolar. And so when I was learning about that, and like I said before I was born, I looked at his life with some empathy because I have my own history of addiction. And I honestly at times was in awe of what he could accomplish with all these issues that he was dealing with. And in 1960 he was prescribed methamphetamine to treat his depression and his alcoholism, and that's when he became addicted to speed. And he was doing that throughout the 60s. And then in the early 70s, he was a mess with the cocaine. I also was told he was doing heroin, There were people who thought that he was doing heroin in the 1950s when he was on the set of When to Cross the Everglades, which is one of the movies he directed and then was fired from towards the end of his career. But what was hard was finding out where he was in 1970, 71, 72, 73, when my mother was married to my stepfather, because I needed my father to come home and rescue me. And when in my research I tracked his whereabouts, and I discovered that he was like doing all kinds of drugs with these young students, and he at one point was staying in Hollywood, a car drive away from where we were living, and he was putting together this movie that he made with his students, and they were drinking a lot and doing a lot of drugs, and that was really hard. That's when it really hit home that my father didn't come home because he rather do drugs and drink than be a parent. It didn't have anything to do with making movies, and that was a real blow. And his life was certainly chaotic. He didn't remain friends with his peers from Hollywood. The only person who stayed in his life was John Houseman, who had produced his first movie and had kind of groomed him to be a director, taken him under his wing in the late 30s, early 40s, before he directed. He lost everything. Like, when I started to look at him as an addict and to have been a victim of his addiction, you know, it was enlightening. It was like it kind of brought him down to earth. Like, he was no longer a god, and he was a human being with this affliction. And there were moments during the research when I felt it like I would have felt it when I was a child if I hadn't been in denial. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's worth saying that now this is a guy, your dad, who had made, I don't know, at least 20 movies,
Yeah.
probably, right? And I mean, he was a talented guy. And so by the time that you were growing up, he was moving into that, that dive, but he had been a functional addict. Or we could say, I guess it's one way to say it, for years, where he was actually like the guy in Hollywood, and like he was still making movies, and he was the go-to guy and all of this. So it's like then it's like I felt that so much reading your book. It's like you see when he was a young guy, like you said, and he was doing, like they were doing these sort of theater for a cause and like all of this. And he was obviously just motivated and optimistic and excited about all of that. And then you see he's got all this talent, and he goes into movies and he's living the life. And then it's just such a showcase of what addiction can do to a person and their talents and their personality. And it was really sad, but it's insightful. And so
Yeah.
I think that is a big thing in your book is the sadness and the tragedy of what addiction did to someone like that.
Right. I mean, he had so much, and it's like, what a fall. you know? I mean, and you're right. He directed, he directed Rebel Without a Cause. He directed In a Lonely Place. He directed masterpieces that hold up to this day, that attract theaters filled of people. Just recently I introduced his film Johnny Guitar at a screening here in New York, and it was packed. The theater was packed. Same when I introduced In a Lonely Place. The theater was packed with young people, not just old people, but young people in their 20s who are curious about Nicca Ray, and that he made an impact on people's lives. And he's, in my humble opinion, one of the greatest directors of the 20th century. And I believe there are other people who believe the same. He was definitely an important piece of the film industry of the 20th century. And the movie he was making with his students is a mess. and you can see addiction all over it. It doesn't make any sense. And the only people he could get to work on a film with him were these students when he was teaching. People, I think, try and make that movie into something bigger and better and oh so avant-garde and underground. But if you look at who Nicca Ray was in 1952, let's say 1953, and then 20 years later in 1973, and what he's doing, it's like his brain is just scrambled. Like he put himself on the screen. You can watch his movies and get a sense of who this man was. So he put himself in this movie that he made in the early 70s, and I keep bringing that movie up because that's the movie. That's like when I watch that movie, I see the man who couldn't show up to be a father, and he was really scrambled. So that addiction took. My mom used to call him a shell when he came back home in, I think it was 1973, when I was 12, when he came back into our lives. My mom used to always say he was a shell of himself.
And I felt that it was palpable, the sadness with that, because you did such a good job, I think, of really portraying how vibrant he was at one time, through interviews and through other research you did, that he really was I call him a larger than life character. I mean, he really was. And then, yeah, you see the way that he self-destructed, and that is just really a huge tragedy for you, everyone, for your family, for everyone around him. And I think it's like that chaos that seemed to follow him around. He did, leave the family situation when you were young and stopped contributing any money. And so your mom was doing her best to hold everything together. And then she ultimately got remarried to your stepfather, who was really, really a bad character. And this is
Yeah.
kind of just a theme in your book is that there weren't a lot of boundaries in your family, in your extended family, and it just was not. It was passed down. It was a situation that already was there. It wasn't like your parents were creating this out of thin air. I mean, it was something that they grew up with as well. So, but there were not a lot of boundaries, and then on top of that, she didn't pick a very. She unfortunately picked a not great guy, and then he had a son who did sexually abuse you. And this is something I've talked about with a couple other guests, and I think it's an important issue because you had to suffer from that for quite an extended period of time, not to mention a very unstable, abusive stepfather. But the sexual abuse is something that seems like it has such a profound effect on people that I just don't know if others always understand how life altering that can really be. And not to say that people can't heal and do, and move past it and all of that, which people do all the time, but just that the effects of that. If you could speak a little bit to that, I want to make sure we address it.
Okay, well, thank you so much for wanting to address it. I think it's really important to talk about because people get really uncomfortable talking about it. And so it's swept under the rug. And so it kind of keeps the secret going because a large part of the sexual abuse is the secret that we have to keep. In my case, my stepbrother threatened to hurt me if I said anything. It went on for 3 years on a practically daily basis. I was 8 years old. There are books that suggest because you lose yourself when the abuse starts, you lose your personhood, right? But when you're 8 years old, how much of a personhood do you have? You haven't fully developed yet. Like I wrote a poem about it. I remember that I liked hopscotch. Who was I before the abuse occurred? I liked to laugh a lot. I liked to play hopscotch. I liked to draw. I became very sad. I started overeating. I was sexualized at such a young age that it influenced the way that I conducted myself as a teenager. I was very promiscuous. I didn't know how to say no. I didn't know that I had a right to say no until I was 26 years old and in therapy. And I was in a relationship with a man who I didn't want to be with. And I kept saying, he's too this or he's too that. And after months of saying stuff like that, my therapist said, are you sexually attracted to him? And I'm like, no. And she said, well, you don't have to be with him. And I'm like, I don't, because he was sexually attracted to me. And what was really interesting was that in the course of our relationship, I couldn't say it's over, but my body closed up. The effects that the sexual abuse had on me were so deep. So the way that I would be in relationships, I have been in a relationship with my partner for 34 years, and I feel like that's a miracle. But like the relationships before him were relationships where I was totally sexualized. I chose men who weren't interested in anything I had to say. It was just like I looked really pretty, and that's what my value was. And so like at first our sexual lives were real vibrant, but as soon as I would get to know someone, I would shut down. And then there's the whole aspect of the trauma of it, and always feeling like you're going to be attacked, and always being hyper vigilant when outside, and always knowing the escape routes. Having night terrors. I've had night terrors since I was 8. I learned just in the last several years that they were night terrors. I thought, oh, I just have these bad dreams, and some of them are recurring, but I I've been in treatment for PTSD, so I'm learning what the effects of the abuse had on me. I don't feel that I'm a victim of the abuse anymore, but it took a long time, and it took a lot of therapy to be able to move past it, take responsibility for my actions. I couldn't do anything. I can't do anything about what was done to me. It's done. It's over. I can't do anything to the perpetrator, but I can learn to live my life differently than I did when I was a teenager or in my young 20s. And it's a continual thing. I mean, there's like body image stuff. I mean, all the stuff that comes from something that was done to you, the self-loathing, the feeling dirty, feeling different, and having to contend with that when you're a little girl and you don't have the language, and your parents aren't doing anything to stop it. And I believe like it was pretty clear to me as early as my mid 20s that I believed my mother had probably been a victim of sexual abuse. And so that's why she couldn't see what was happening to me, because if she saw what was happening to me, then she would have to deal with what happened to her. And sure enough, when I wrote Ray by Ray and I interviewed her, I learned, yes, she was a victim of sexual abuse. Yes, her father totally sexualized her and was inappropriate with her. So then it made sense, and I could, like, I was angry at my mom for many years because why didn't she see? I mean, my stepbrother would fondle me in the backseat of my mother's car when we were driving to the beach. He would put a towel over me. My mom was right there, right there. Why didn't she see? And I was so angry at her for so long. And when I started to get to know her and her story, that anger started to dissipate. Even like going into my stepbrother's brain, and his father used to beat him, so his father would beat him and he would come to me and in his way beat me. It was like this trickle down effect.
You mentioned that in your book. You mentioned there was like some part of you that did sympathize with your stepbrother because he was being abused by your stepfather, and it's so complicated then too. It's like there's these complicated layers because you're being abused by this guy who you also have sympathy for in a different way, and I feel like that probably adds to the messiness of your feelings and the complications.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I just think about some of the boyfriends I had when I was young, and it's like, oh my God, it made perfect sense. The kind of person that I would end up with, it's like very messy too. And you. And
But we should say that you said you did go down a road of promiscuity and you also had addiction issues early on during the sexual abuse, after the sexual abuse. But you did become sober when you were 20 years old,
yeah.
which, especially in your family, reading the book and hearing how rampant it was around you everywhere and in Hollywood in general, it sounds like. But you did somehow, by yourself, you stopped, even though you talk about a boyfriend you were with who I think was addicted to heroin,
Yeah.
and you still stayed sober and
Yeah.
got out of that relationship. So I think that's pretty amazing. And it has to have, first of all, it takes a lot of strength, a lot of discipline, a lot of, wherewithal, but also has to have completely changed the trajectory of your life and what it could have been.
Oh my gosh, getting sober and meeting other sober women who guided me along. What a gift to have been exposed and then to accept that in my life. I had a half brother who, when I was 19, was sober, and he brought me to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and that was in 1980. There weren't a lot of young people, and he brought me to a young people's meeting, and everyone was older than me. And it took me a year from that point to get sober, but I met women who took me under their wing and were these powers of example of how to put together a life, how to build a foundation. And so at 20, I started to build a foundation for which I could grow from. And a lot of the teachings were about taking responsibility for my actions. And it was really important for me to look at my behavior and see what I could change in my behavior. Like, for instance, the promiscuity. I didn't have to go and cheat on a boyfriend. I stayed with the boyfriend. I was going to be a good girl. It wasn't fully fleshed out, but in my mind, I was going to be a good girl and I was going to be this good girlfriend. It just turned out that the boyfriend, was starting his heroin addiction. And, choices. I didn't know any different. Things were better because I remembered what I did the night before and I knew who was sleeping in my bed. So that was great. It was a lot different. I don't even know if I answered the question.
Oh, you did. And so another thing I want to jump to, your dad, he did get sober for some period of time, but he ended up getting cancer, and I don't think he had a ton of time,
No.
honestly, in his adulthood then sober, but at the end, very, very tail end of his life, he was. He did come to your house to visit you and your mother one
Yes.
time, and he left you a letter that he slid under your door, I think, because it was like you were kind of, at that time, you were kind of like, I don't want to deal with this guy. He had, let's be clear and put it in context, he had shown up a few other times very strung out or with cocaine. He was not pleasant to be around the other times. So this time he slid this letter under your door. And, I'm going to have you talk about that because tell me, just kind of briefly give a summary of what he said. And then let's talk about what that meant to you then and what it means to you now.
Okay. In the letter, he wrote some of what he said was like, I'll be the angriest of the angry, the loneliest of the lonely, the saddest of the sad. And he writes about maybe if he had gone to someone and talked to someone and let someone know what he was feeling, he wouldn't have been so alone in the first place. And that to me is like the whole theme of the letter. That's the meat of the letter. That's the part of the letter that I really attached to because he got it. He knew exactly what was going on with me. Only spending an hour with me at dinner, a dinner that I refused to talk to him or eat. And he wrote that I had a voice that could make rivers run and that I just needed to work on it. I had wanted to be an actress when I was a kid, when I was 13, 14. I don't know if he knew it or if my mom told him, but I had been in school plays and stuff. And my mom was always against my sister and I having anything to do with Hollywood, but she would, always talk about her own movies. And she started dancing professionally when she was 14 and 15, and she wouldn't let me go and find an agent or help me or anything, but she let me start waiting on tables when I was 14. But my father's letter just really hit home, and I remember reading it and it being too much, and I'm 99% sure I went out and got loaded. But I carried that letter around me everywhere I went, from every punk rock crash pad. That letter went with me, and I never lost it. I kept it close to my chest. And I remember moments when I was really deep into my addiction, taking that letter and reading it. I was the angriest of the angry, the loneliest of the lonely. And just like, where are you, Daddy? Where was he to talk to? There was no one for me to talk to when I was 15 and a half and he left me that letter. There was no one for me to talk to. I couldn't talk to my mom about that stuff. And here was this man who was kind of available, but no, it was a letter he left under the door. And so how was I supposed to talk to him?
And then he's gone. He's
He's
gone
gone.
again.
He's gone. And then, a year and a half later, he died.
Yeah, and I hear when you're talking about it, I can just hear that again, like the loss and the importance that had for you, for him to really say anything of substance to you, to make, to really like reach out to connect in any way. I remember in your book, and upon his death, a couple times you mentioned you're just like, the one thing that you wanted was to have him get the chance to know you, to know who you were and to know you. And I guess I'm connecting with that because it's like, then he's gone, then he was gone for good. He'd passed away, and now that's never going to happen. But it sounds like at least that one letter was like a sense that he saw you in that moment, and he felt something that you are going through, and he did have some sort of knowing about you. And so that is that importance on that letter. To me, listening to you, is that, yeah, in that moment you felt like he was seeing you.
Oh, yeah. Like we could have had a conversation. He did see me. He saw me better than anyone saw me at that time, and that was a gift that my father had. He could really key into people and read them really quickly. That's what made one of the things that made him a really good director. He just saw people. Vim Vendors would say that my dad had an eagle's eye, and I think that's pretty true. I feel like the conversations that I didn't get to have with my dad, I got to have while I was working on Ray by Ray, whether they're in the book or not. Especially when I went to the Warner Brothers archive at USC, and they brought out all these boxes, mainly from ephemera from Rebel Without a Cause. And it was like I was sitting in the family attic. It's like my family never had a house or an attic with old papers and family heirlooms and stuff like that. But this was my equivalent, like kind of having a conversation in that room in the library at USC, oh my God, these letters between my father and Jack Warner, I'm getting to read. I didn't get to have a conversation with my dad about that time in real life between me and him, but here I am with him, with his past. So I kind of created this way for me to have this conversation with him that I'd always wanted to have all my life.
That comes across in the book, and you really do develop who he was, develop who your mom was. And I think that's what a lot of what we talk about in this podcast is, like, people have their own reasons why they inflict harm on their children or on other people, and it's not necessarily out of some sort of evil intent. Or I think you just really did a good job of making them well-rounded and showing that they made mistakes, and they weren't perfect in any way, and nobody is, but that they also were just normal people doing their best. And I think you say in the book, engaging with trying to be a part of society and the community and create things and contribute and all that. What would you say to that? Just sort of the idea of looking back on them now as just these whole beings with good things and bad things.
Well, like we said in the very beginning, human beings aren't black and white. And my parents were very colorful. And I'm really thankful for that today. They both led these spectacular lives and were a part of Hollywood history. They were very engaged, like you said. My father in the political theater in the early 1930s, instead of going to Broadway, he became involved in what was called a leftist theater called the Theater of Action. But at that time, there was a faction of theater people who created anti-Broadway theater. Their intent was to become the voice of the people and to provide theater for who could afford it. They would take the theater out onto the streets because Broadway was so expensive. The common person, average person, couldn't afford Broadway, much like it is today. So my dad was at the pulse of it was the depression, and people were starving, and there was all this stuff going on, and he was at the pulse of that. And then he worked with Alan Lomax and did this radio show with Alan Lomax called Back Where I Come From, which featured Woody Guthrie, Lead Belly, Pete Seeger. And it was the first radio show to bring black and white people on stage together. And because of that, they couldn't get funding, but it was for CBS radio. But my dad was right there, and he used to go driving across country with a big tape recorder and record stories of very poor people living in most rural parts of America, and he'd get their stories and he'd turn those stories into plays. And that was for the WPA. He was working for the WPA. So he brought all this experience to his movies, and my mom was taking dance lessons in Detroit when she was 7 years old. Her older brother was a genius. He graduated Berkeley when he was 15 and became the youngest person to become a professor at Princeton University, and lived and worked there for his entire life. But so her brother introduced her to Back Where I Come From. So they were at the pulse too as little kids. They were out, their parents didn't make sure that they were home at a certain time. These kids were allowed to take a bus from the suburbs of Detroit into the city to take dance lessons. And then when my mom was a dancer, she was dancing with Fred Astaire and Bing Crosby, but she was really in love with other dancers, and she'd call themselves gypsies. And then when she was older, she was very involved in anti-war demonstrations, the anti-Vietnam War, and finding housing for Black Panthers and helping women get abortion, standing up for women's rights. She was very politically active in the 1960s and stuff. So they were on the pulse of things, and they did do things for their community. They weren't just, excuse my language, but they weren't just fucked up parents. My mom would never agree to being an intellectual because she never graduated high school because she was dancing. So she always had the doubt that she was as smart as her brother, but she was just as smart as her brother, only in a different way, not in an academic way. And she was an intellectual. She just loved to get down at the dinner table and have those conversations about the politics at the time and what was happening in the community. And my dad, he might have been a drug addict and stuff, but he wasn't just a drug addict,
Right. Well, he kept trying. I mean, there was I think a couple projects that he worked on and it was scrambled and you said it had addiction all over it, but he still couldn't stop trying to make movies right till the end. Even though he was not the same guy, he was still trying to make movies.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of Lightning Over Water. There he was making a movie, and he was sick as a dog, so sick. but he had to. It was more important to him to make this movie than it was to see his children, to see his daughters. And, when I was younger, that really hurt. But when I got to know him and his work and his life, of course he ended his life like that. There was no other way for him to end his life. He was a filmmaker. I had interviewed this woman, Janine Bassinger. She's a film person and teaches film or taught film. And she used to say, filmmakers like my dad would eat film. They would actually eat the film, if they could.
Yeah, it's just like a part of his being.
Yeah.
It seemed like. And your mom also, she was a performer. She was a dancer. She was comfortable being the center of attention and carrying on and performing in front of people and those sorts of things. And at the end of her life, she was still doing that. You mentioned in the book, they kind of both showed a way to go out that was like more, it's more joyful and more peaceful than a lot of people think of it. Instead of being fear ridden,
Right.
they were still living to the best of their ability, living the way that they wanted to live.
Absolutely. Like my mom, I remember one day my mom, I took care of her. She retired to Arizona and I went out to Arizona and we were with a group of her friends and she announced, "Everyone, I just want to let you know about this journey that I'm on. I'm dying." So let's all go on this journey with her. And she was the star. The week before she died, she got we got mani pedis and she got gold glitter nails and toenails and go mom go. Like so
Good for
fantastic.
her.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, these were the last days. She knew that, but yeah, gold glitter that I'll never forget that. And I think that's a great power of example. Both my parents, how they, in a sense, welcomed death rather than fear it, rather than push it away. Here I am. This is who I am right now.
Yeah. Yeah. That was something nice to read about, especially after reading the book about their characters and all of their antics and what they would get up to. And then you're just like, yeah, I mean, this feels right. It feels like they did it right, you
Yeah,
know? So yeah, that was nice. Well, I've kept you an hour now. So let me ask you, is there anything else that you want to make sure that we talk about?
I do have another memoir coming out, and it's called Love and Cigarettes, and it's a mother-daughter story. So I go more into my mother, and I'm really excited about that. And it's just been really great talking to you. And
Oh, you too.
know,
You too. Thank you so much. And that's nice to hear that you're going to have a new memoir and a mother-daughter one.
yeah, yeah.
That sounds really nice. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've written a play that's going to be produced in New York City, and it's memoir-esque. It's autobiographical. It's about my mom and dad and my sister and me, and what happens, what it is like for children of celebrity. How do they find their own gold star? But it's also, about my mom is sick mentally and physically, and she's starting to transition into the next life. And Nick comes and becomes her guide into. So we see the whole family dynamic
Wow.
through this. And so I'm really excited about that. I think
Yeah, that sounds really cool.
yeah, it's called Cry of the Butterfly, and that'll be coming in New York. So, yeah, it's just really good. I'm so grateful to you for bringing up and allowing me to talk about the sexual abuse because there is healing from it. And I think it's really important for men and women who are suffering from it and are in the depths of the despair of it that there is a way out and we don't have to be victims of it for our whole life. And there are tools out there for those of us who have experienced that kind of trauma to live in the light. We can get out of that darkness and live in the light. And there are answers out there. There's help out there. And I just really feel for people who maybe even haven't told anybody.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah, and real quick, if you don't mind, just one more question about that. I want to make sure we cover it. Is just in terms of, even if just very briefly, if you can just talk about some of the tools that have helped you step out of some of the more acute pain from the sexual abuse.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I started therapy when I was in my mid 20s, and just being able to scream it out was really helpful in the beginning. I've done things like write letters from me now to the little girl then, and then from the little girl to the big girl now. I've written to the perpetrator. There was this book that I read in the very beginning of my healing called Betrayal of Innocence. There are some really, really great books out there that are really helpful. And through those books, I learned some tools. I went to cognitive behavior therapy and started tools like for instance, when I have a night terror and I wake up and I have to say, okay, I am in my apartment. I'm an adult. There's no one here who's going to hurt me. And I repeat that and I look at my surroundings, and my surroundings are different. I live with a lovely man, and we've created this beautiful home. So I can look at that and go, no one's here, no one's going to hurt me. And so that little trick has been really helpful because I don't carry the night terror with me into the day. Whereas before I learned that little trick, I would just be carrying around this despair. There's so many little tools like that, like where are my feet? Look at ground. Let's get grounded. I exercise. I like doing weights. They ground me and help me from disassociating because I'll still disassociate. I lived my life disassociated. In cognitive behavior therapy, I learned to identify when I was disassociating. So, like, if I catch myself kind of separating my head from my body, I am be like, okay, where are my feet? Where are my feet? I'm here. It's that same thing. I'm here right now. Take a deep breath. Coloring, the adult coloring books really, really help a lot. I have this stone. It says serenity on it, and I hold it, and that'll ground me. Because I think like a lot of the way that I carry it now is in the disassociation. I might not even know that I'm being triggered or something. But I don't have to plan for my escape anymore. I lived like always knowing my escape route out on the streets, just always, and I don't do that anymore. That's really nice. And I think it's all like a culmination of therapy and reading and trying out the suggestions. People suggest, or some book I read might suggest I do something, and I try it and see what works.
Yeah, I think that all of that stuff is really good. And, just giving ideas, giving things that might resonate with people because they might try any of these things also, or maybe didn't think to. So yeah, I really appreciate you talking about that and, talking about the effects and talking about your healing because I do think that's an important thing to talk about because I think a lot of people, like you said earlier, it is secretive by nature. It's set up to be that way. And a lot of people don't talk about it because it's just not a comfortable topic for a lot of people, but it does happen. So I
Yes.
appreciate that. And I just appreciate so much your time today and talking through all these issues. Thank you so much.
No, thank you so much for reaching out to me and having this conversation. It's been really wonderful.